Snowdrifts against a low brick building in Moscow. It is the winter of 1931. Inside, under a single bulb and a halo of breath fog, a handful of young engineers huddle over a hand-built combustion chamber that looks more like an oversized blowtorch than the future. Their leader, a gentle, bespectacled romantic with a Latvian surname, Friedrich Zander, cradles sketches of winged rockets heading for Mars. Another, a square-jawed aircraft designer with a glider pilot's hands, Sergei Korolev, leans in to listen. They call their club the Group for the Study of Reactive Motion, GIRD. It will be the seed of Soviet rocketry, germinating years before the word V-2 will terrify European cities. This is the story of that seed, how it sprouted in laboratories funded by civil defense societies and the Red Army, how it inched forward through fragile prototypes and backyard test stands, and how it was nearly uprooted by the purges. It is not a story of triumph marching in a straight line. It is a story of experiments, arguments, near misses, prison terms, and a few small shots that cracked the sky, just enough to mark a beginning. Long before GIRD, there was the idea. In a provincial town called Kaluga, a schoolteacher named Konstantin Tsiolkovsky had worked out the mathematics of spaceflight, a relationship between mass, exhaust velocity, and change in speed that later textbooks would call the rocket equation. In 1903, he published Exploration of Outer Space by Means of Rocket Devices, describing a multi-stage rocket using liquid oxygen and hydrogen. Few noticed at the time, but the paper would ripple quietly through circles of enthusiasts in Russia and later the Soviet Union. By the late 1920s, those circles had become workshops. One of the earliest formal workshops was not in Moscow at all, but in Leningrad. In 1921, a chemist named Nikolai Tikhomirov set up what became the Gas Dynamics Laboratory, GDL, under the Red Army's main artillery directorate. The team would soon include Valentin Glushko, a young engineer obsessed with high-energy propellants and new engine cycles, and Georgy Langimok, a practical designer with a gift for turning concepts into hardware. GDL first chased solid propellant rockets. Their work would evolve into the unguided RS-82 and RS-132 rockets, tested from aircraft in the early 1930s, the ancestors in lineage and technique of the Katyusha rocket artillery that would appear in 1941. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Zander, a dreamer, engineer, and public advocate for interplanetary flight, helped organize GIRD in 1931. The sponsoring umbrella was Osoaviachim, a nationwide paramilitary and civil defense society that cultivated aviation, radio, and technical hobbies. Funding was meager. The joke in the corridors, half pride and half complaint, was that GIRD also stood for Group of Engineers Working for Nothing. But the names gathering around that drafty room would echo for decades. Korolev, who had trained in aircraft and brought systems thinking. Mikhail Tikhonravov, a fellow glider pilot who loved clean design. And Yuri Pobedonostsev, who built test stands and instrumentation. Even in photographs, you can see a dual identity. They are amateurs in salary and space, professionals in intent. GIRD organized itself into brigades. Zander led the first, focused on liquid engines. Tikhonravov led another, focused on vehicle design. Korolev headed a brigade pursuing piloted rocket planes and cruise missiles. The work was not theoretical. They machined injectors and gaskets. They plumbed tanks for gasoline and liquid oxygen. They learned, the hard way, about combustion instability and burn-throughs. One engine, Project 10, the heart of a small vehicle they called GIRD-X, taught them that copper chambers need cooling, and that alcohol may be a more forgiving fuel than gasoline. A dozen years later, those hands-on lessons would matter on an intercontinental scale. In Leningrad, GDL's Glushko walked a parallel path with his ORM series, experimental rocket motors 1 through 50 and beyond, pushing oxidizers like nitric acid and fuel cocktails nobody would dare keep in a home shop. GDL's rhythm was more military than GIRD's. They had formal orders to produce rockets for planes and artillery. Yet communication between the two cities never stopped. Engineers traveled back and forth. Letters crossed desks. The Red Army leadership, watching both streams, drew the obvious administrative conclusion: bring them together. On September 21, 1933, a decree merged GDL and GIRD into a new institution, the Reactive Scientific Research Institute, better known by its Russian acronym RNII. Ivan Klimanov from GDL was named director. Korolev from GIRD became his deputy. RNII would concentrate the country's rocket talent under one roof, with a test range of its own. For a moment, the horizons widened. But before the merger's ink was dry, GIRD's tiny rockets had already flown. If you stand in a stubbled field outside Moscow and look up through summer haze, 400 meters is not far. It is a thin layer of sky, the height a small cloud might cruise on a warm day. For the engineers of GIRD, it was a cliff face. On August 17, 1933, a slender cylinder rose from a vertical rail and clawed its way into that layer. The vehicle was designated GIRD-09. Its propulsion is variously described as a hybrid: liquid oxygen as oxidizer with a solid or gelled fuel, or as a liquid oxygen vehicle in its own right. Contested. Sources disagree on whether GIRD-09's fuel was truly liquid or a solid fuel matrix fed by LOX. What is not disputed is that LOX was used and that the flight lasted under half a minute, climbing a few hundred meters. Tikhonov's brigade led the design. The ascent was brief, the recovery, if you can call it that, hard. But for the first time, a Soviet rocket powered by a cryogenic oxidizer had flown. Korolev's brigade pursued a second vehicle, GIRD-X, the Roman numeral 10, powered by a regeneratively cooled liquid engine fed by liquid oxygen and alcohol. As testing burned holes through chambers and scorched pipes, the team improvised fixes, thickening walls, changing injector patterns, rerouting coolant. On November 25, 1933, the rocket cleared its rail and leapt into the air. It rose only tens of meters. It did not carry a payload to the upper atmosphere. But a Soviet engine burning two liquids, with cooling through its walls, had done what it was designed to do. In the span of 100 days, GIRD had produced 2 powered flights using liquid oxygen. In narrative, in national memory, these are footnotes. In engineering history, they are a line drawn in ink. To set that line against the better-known German timeline is not a nationalist claim, but a chronological one. The A-4, renamed V-2 in wartime propaganda, would not achieve its first fully successful flight until October 3, 1942, almost 9 years later. In the 1930s, German enthusiasts at the VFR experimented with liquid engines on a small scale, and military laboratories advanced the art in parallel. Still, the weapon that would bombard London belonged to the 1940s. The Soviet experiments we are tracing belong to the early 1930s. A different world and a different question. How do you make a rocket engine run for seconds without destroying itself? The new institute, RNII, carried those questions forward. For every person who dreamed of space, there were 10 who woke to orders stamped by the Defense Commissariat. Staff moved to Moscow. Leningrad remained as the branch office. The corridors were crowded, the workshops expanded. RNII's charter covered everything from aircraft-launched rockets to solid-fueled battlefield munitions and liquid engines for future missiles. The Sofrino test range, newly organized, gave them a place to fire larger motors away from apartment blocks and tram lines. And yet, while the engineering problems were difficult, the political environment was lethal. In 1937, as the Great Purge spread through every bureau and battalion in the country, RNII lost its leadership. Director Ivan Klymanov was arrested. Chief Engineer Georgy Langemak was arrested with him. Both were executed in early 1938. The vacuum was filled by men better connected than qualified. And in March 1938, the NKVD came for Glushko, the Institute's most experienced liquid propellant specialist. Under torture, he signed confessions. In June, they came for Korolev. He was beaten, starved, and shipped east to the Kolyma goldfields, where winter could kill a man in days. He would return months later, not because the charges had evaporated, but because a new security chief chose to retry him. His sentence was commuted to work in a sharashka, a prison design bureau, first under the famous aircraft designer Andrei Tupolev, then in Kazan with Glushko on rocket engines. Those two men, Glushko and Korolev, would never fully reconcile what happened in 1938. Some documents say Glushko denounced Korolev. Others describe confessions extracted and then used against colleagues. What is clear is that the line between survival and complicity in those rooms was blurred by terror, and the cost to the Institute's work was enormous. RNII, renamed NII-3 in 1937 under a different commissariat, survived, but it stumbled. Projects were canceled or reassigned. Whole teams were reconstituted from scratch. The momentum of 1933 slowed to a crawl. Still, technical work did not stop. The solid rocket branch matured the RS-82 and RS-132 series for aircraft, seeding a doctrine of rocket-armed fighters and attack planes. On the liquid side, engineers refined nitric acid-kerosene combinations, experimented with curtain cooling in chambers, and learned the corrosive personalities of every propellant they could safely warehouse. The point here is not that Soviet rocketry thrived during the purges, it did not, but that a body of craft knowledge survived in notebooks, test reports, and the hands of technicians who outlasted their bosses. The German army crossed the Soviet frontier on June 22, 1941, everything accelerated or went dark. The most visible wartime rockets were solid propellant, the famous Katyusha batteries firing rippling salvos from truck-mounted rails, and the aircraft rockets hammered into the noses and wings of Yakovlev and Lavochkin fighters. The more delicate art of liquid engines did not yield an operational missile before 1945. In one wartime project, Korolev, released in 1944 with the rank of colonel and a ban still on discussing his arrest, worked with Glushko on a small rocket booster for fighters, the RD-1KZ, fitted experimentally to a Lavochkin interceptor for rapid climbs. It was a technical success and an operational dead end, a lesson learned and filed. By then, Peenemünde was launching A-4 rockets that arced over the Baltic and blew apart on beaches in Poland and Britain. The scale difference between the A-4 and anything the Soviets had built before the war was not one of centimeters, but orders of magnitude. Thousands of kilograms of propellant, turbopumps, and guidance systems at the edge of contemporary technology. Assembly lines buried in mountains. After 1945, both victorious superpowers would scavenge that project, its engineers, drawings, tooling, and wreckage, and redirect it. But to treat the Soviet rocket story as something that began with the V-2 is to miss the thread that made sense of the post-war decade. The thread is GIRD and GDL, and the thin line of flame that rose over Moscow fields in 1933. Let us pause and examine what those early experiments established, and what they did not. First, they proved that Soviet teams could design, build, and fire liquid oxygen engines, regeneratively cooled, valve-controlled, with enough structural and thermal margin to run for seconds, without imported blueprints. The flights of GIRD-09 and GIRD-X were modest in altitude, but the teams solved problems that recur at any scale: propellant feed, ignition reliability, heat flux, and guidance stabilization off a launch rail. Those solutions would inform later, larger engines. Second, they built a human network. Engineers who soldered lines on GIRD's benches would become senior designers in the 1950s. Mikhail Tikhonravov would later be central to the Sputnik proposal and concept studies of orbital rendezvous. Glushko, released from the Sharashka, would found an engine bureau that built the high-performance kerosene engines of the R-7 and its successors. Korolev would be appointed chief designer of long-range missiles in 1946. Even disputes between Korolev and Glushko over propellant choices, for example, trace a lineage back to the 1930s, when their tastes in oxidizers and their risk tolerances diverged. Third, those experiments established an institutional lineage. RNII's mergers and renamings would eventually lead to the post-war network of design bureaus, OKBs, whose acronyms still dot launch manifests today. The GDL tradition of solid rockets would reappear in battlefield systems. The GIRD tradition of small vertical test flights would scale to sounding rockets and eventually suborbital trials of R-series ballistic missiles. What those experiments did not do is equally important. They did not yield a Soviet equivalent of a long-range ballistic missile in the 1930s. They did not produce a militarily useful weapon during the war that could match the A-4 in range or payload. The difference was not purely a matter of talent. It was also about continuity. Germany insulated its rocket program under a single army project, integrated with an industrial base at Peenemünde and later in underground factories. The Soviet program of the 1930s was split between cities, buffeted by political storms, and interrupted at critical moments by arrests and executions. Engineering is cumulative. Terror resets the ledger. There are human scenes worth remembering amid the dates. Zander, the romantic who rallied GIRD in 1931, died of illness in early 1933 before GIRD-X flew. He had coined the slogan, "Onward to Mars," and sketched a winged cruise missile, Project 216, that, not built, would read today like a forebear of every supersonic concept poster on a lab wall. His grave in Kislovodsk would later be adorned with a model of the little rocket that did fly. If you trace your finger over the photographs of GIRD's founding team, he is the one on the far right, thin, with the intense gaze of a man who stayed up too late reading about orbit. There is also the image of a man in a prison mugshot, Korolev in 1938, with a broken jaw and dark circles under his eyes, and the less photographed image of the same man 6 years later standing at a rail siding en route to Germany to study the ruins of the V-2 production lines. The arc between those two images contains the core paradox of this story. The early Soviet rocket program started before the V-2, was nearly destroyed by the politics that built it, and then, after 1945, was rebuilt, partly on the bones of the enemy's work. And there are the workaday moments, invisible except in the tone of memoirs. A test stand scrub because a valve sticks in the frost. A launch rail repainted in the dark because a visiting marshal prefers a different shade. An argument over injector holes that ends with a short, bitter laugh and a decision to drill. What, finally, does it mean to say Stalin's secret rocket program before Germany's V-2? It means that in the early 1930s, under the banners of Oso Aviakhim and the Red Army, Soviet engineers developed and test-fired liquid oxygen rocket engines and small rockets, at a time when the German A-series was still years from a complete militarized weapon. It means that institutions like GDL and GIRD existed, were merged into RNII in 1933, and produced test flights, GIRD-09 and GIRD-X, whose dates are inscribed in lab diaries and newspaper clippings. It does not mean that the Soviet Union fielded an operational weapon earlier than Germany, or that one country's early program negates the technical achievements of the other. It means that the genealogy of spaceflight is messier and more international than a single headline can hold. There are uncertainties we should mark. As noted, the exact classification of GIRD-09's propellant, hybrid with LOX and a solid/gelled fuel, or liquid, varies by source. The consensus today leans toward hybrid with LOX. Altitude claims for both flights are estimates based on the period's limited instrumentation. About 400 meters and about 80 meters are the numbers most often cited. The precise design roles of individuals in those tiny teams overlap in the records. Brigades shared machine tools and hands. Where this script has had to choose among interpretations, it has chosen the ones most attested in contemporary reports and later archival histories, and flagged the rest. The last scene returns us to that winter workshop in 1931. The bulb is still dim. The breath still fogs. A young engineer, call him any of the names we now know, leans over a kerosene-stained notebook and calculates heat flux through a chamber wall a few millimeters thick. He is not thinking about the R-7, about Sputnik, about Gagarin. He is thinking about keeping copper from melting for 5 more seconds. Outside, the wind licks at the eaves. Across the country, in a Leningrad lab, a different engineer lays out the propellant channels of an ORM-50 motor that will hiss and cough in a test cell next week. In Kaluga, an old man runs his fingers over the margins of a paper he wrote before the wars, the one few read in 1903, and traces equations he once hoped would raise eyes to the sky. And somewhere across the Baltic, on a lonely beach that no one in Moscow is watching, in 1933, surf breaks on the shore. History will later stamp dramatic dates, Peenemünde, October 1942, but the quieter ones matter too. August 17, 1933, a small rocket climbs a few hundred meters and falls. November 25, 1933, another follows. The sky, indifferent, receives both. The engineers take notes. The secret is not that they flew, it is that in the face of politics and physics alike, they kept trying. When the post-war world wakes to headlines about satellites and spaceships, it will look for a first step. This is one of them, a group of underpaid engineers working for nothing in a country convulsed by change, holding a torch to a chamber wall and listening for the pitch of the burn. They were not alone in the world. Across oceans, Goddard was firing rockets in the New Mexico desert. And in Germany, calculus and ambition gathered at army ranges. But in Moscow and Leningrad, long before the A4 was a weapon, the Soviet Union had already put fire to metal and learned, painfully and precisely, how to keep it there. The story of GIRD and GDL does not erase what came later. It explains it. It shows that when Korolev stood in a captured factory in 1945 and traced a finger over the smooth lines of a V-2 turbine, he brought to that inspection the memory of charred copper and patched injectors, of November cold on a launch field outside Moscow. It shows that when Glushko argued, years later, for certain propellants and against others, he argued from burns on his own hands. It shows that the Soviet rocket age did not begin with a copy of the A4, but with men and women who, before the war, before the arrests, built small engines and learned the language of fire. In that language, the nouns are simple: oxygen, alcohol, brass, copper. The verbs are simpler: ignite, cool, hold. And the first sentence, in 1933, was only a clause. It ended in a hard landing and a puff of dust. But you can read the rest from here.